Welcome back to part 2 of Remake or Rebreak, Metroid vs. Metroid Zero Mission. In the last part, we discussed the original NES Metroid. While I enjoy the game more than I used to, a lot of the design is half-baked and doesn't hold a candle to most of the later games in the series. In today's video, we're going to continue by answering two questions. How well does Metroid Zero Mission recreate, improve upon, and add to the experience of the original game? Finally, does Zero Mission hold up as a top-tier Metroid game? Let's get to it. In the early 2000s, the Metroid series was experiencing its most successful boom period after an 8-year hiatus. Metroid Prime perfectly transitioned the gameplay into 3D in 2002, while Metroid Fusion subverted the series' 2D conventions and offered a more directly story-driven take on the franchise. Metroid Prime 2 would release soon after, followed by a DS game and a third Prime game on the Wii. To put it mildly, the series had evolved significantly since 1986. During this, the height of the series' popularity, Metroid Zero Mission re-envisioned the game that started it all with the benefit of hindsight. For this review, I'm going to be introducing a new recording toy, the Game Boy Advance Consolizer by Woozle. This little device replaces the screen with the board that converts the raw digital video to an HDMI-friendly format, allowing for the most direct and authentic Game Boy Advance footage on the market. It has some other nifty features as well, but we'll get to that. The basic story follows the blueprints of the original game. Bounty hunter Samus Aran is sent to planet Zebes to infiltrate the space pirate stronghold, eradicate the Metroid menace, and defeat the pirate leader Mother Brain. However, there are a couple of subtle changes to reflect the rather retcon-heavy progression of the series' narrative. In the original game, for example, it was never clear what the space pirates looked like. The only 3 confirmed members were Ridley, Kraid, and Mother Brain. So, were these tiny little gremlins space pirates? What about those giant moths? In the context of an NES game, it didn't really matter that much. But Super Metroid would later establish that space pirates in the main series are either these crustaceous Zebesians or the moth-like key hunters. Obviously, we never saw any Zebesians or key hunters in the original Metroid, so where were all the space pirates in this space pirate base? Zero Mission does address this question, though it's only halfway explained in the game itself. By 2004, the franchise had expanded its production value to include optional lore in Metroid Prime and pages of written dialogue in Fusion. Zero Mission, meanwhile, scales back considerably and communicates most of the story visually through comic book-like cutscenes. On their own, the cutscenes are fairly effective, but without dialogue, they often leave more questions than they answer. For example, you're probably wondering why Ridley is flying around in the space pirate mothership instead of tending to his base on Zebes. In 2002, Nintendo authorized a 2-volume Metroid prequel manga that was released exclusively in Japan, which chronicles the events of Samus's backstory all the way up to the events of the first game. I, of course, am looking at pages of the English fan translation by Snoopy, which is available on Metroid Recon. For the most part, Zero Mission seems to treat the events of the prequel manga as canon. The designs for the space pirate mothership and Mother Brain are lifted straight from the manga, including Ridley's command room. The Dioram and Imago similarly debuted in the manga and appear as mini-bosses in Zero Mission. Samus states in the opening text crawl that she grew up on Zebes, which is showcased in the manga, and later on we see a flashback with the younger Samus and Old Bird, her adopted Chozo father. The last shot of the credits also alludes to Grey Voice, who also appeared in the Zero Mission manga alongside Old Bird. Furthermore, if you use your link cables to connect Zero Mission to Fusion, you can unlock the Japanese Fusion Gallery, which, among other things, depicts Samus growing up on Zebes with the Chozo. So, to finally get back to the Ridley question, in the manga, Federation forces commanded by Adam Malkovich engaged Ridley's forces on the pirate mothership as a distraction so Samus could slip into Zebes and take out Mother Brain while the base was relatively empty. Presumably, this is why Ridley and the pirate mothership don't show up in Zero Mission until after Samus defeats Kraid, which tripped some kind of alarm, I guess? Or more likely, Mother Brain probably just contacted Ridley after that scene in the elevator. The few Zebesians still on Zebes while Ridley was away are shown to have been killed during a Metroid outbreak in Turian. You'll also recall that back in the original game, Kraid wasn't that much bigger than Samus, while in Super Metroid he was large enough to span multiple screens. Zero Mission retcons the first game altogether and establishes that Kraid was always as big as he was in Super Metroid. So yeah, as far as setting up the pieces of the continuity before and after the original Metroid, Zero Mission's story is a welcome update that better familiarizes players with Samus's overall backstory and slots better with later games. Still, given that the prequel manga was never officially released outside of Japan, Ridley having to come back to Zebes and the references to Samus's childhood only served to confuse non-Japanese players. In that respect, I really think Zero Mission could have benefited from lore entries of some kind, especially if it was going to reference the manga so heavily. But as far as reimagining the original plot goes, Zero Mission does a fine job and is definitely an improvement over the original game when it comes to production value. Graphically, not only does Zero Mission completely blow the NES game out of the water, but I'm tempted to call it the best looking game in the series, period. The Prime games look great for their time, but their emphasis on realism can't help but make them look somewhat dated in 2021. Even the most recent game in the series, Samus Returns, looks like a 2005 PSP game. Zero Mission, meanwhile, refines the already great art style from Fusion, taking inspiration from Silver Age comic books with bright, simple colors and defined ink lines. While it wouldn't have been my first choice for a Metroid art style, it fits surprisingly well and stands the test of time better than other games in the series. Now here's where I'd like to introduce a nifty feature of the GBA consolizer. For years, I've argued that older handheld games simply look different on their original screens. And thanks to the consolizer's matrix shader, I can provide footage that better replicates the original color gamut. You can see that games that look garish and oversaturated in the raw output look noticeably better when shaded to match the original screens. Some games, like Donkey Kong Country 2, basically require this shader to look halfway decent. However, things get a little more complicated with later releases like Zero Mission, which were also designed to work on the SP, Game Boy Player, and eventually DS. Later GBA games frequently featured a richer color palette as a result, so initially I was going to choose a matrix preset on a game-by-game basis. After some deliberation, I decided that the raw color matrix looked close enough to that of the Game Boy Player that it would be the best balance of authenticity and fidelity. In retrospect, I regret not going with the GBA matrix, but fixing it now would require re-editing the entire review, and I just don't have time for that. I apologize, and I'll make sure to learn from this for the Fusion review. So with all that out of the way, let's talk about the actual graphics. The barren black backgrounds of the original game have been replaced with dimly lit, cavernous ruins that sell the expanse of the base far better. Similarly, the environments defy the repetitive look of the original. No two rooms in Zero Mission look quite the same, featuring diverse tile sets and tons of detail. Not only is it better to look at, but it's much easier to recognize Planet Zebes as a place that could realistically exist. Compared to the largely monochromatic environments in the NES version, Zero Mission better utilizes accents and complements for a richer color scheme. The sprites themselves are beautifully drawn and feature some impressive looking animation for a Game Boy Advance game. Samus alone has hundreds of frames of animation and they look absolutely stellar in motion. The bosses are probably the best looking assets in the game and are assembled from impressive multi-layered sprites. Zero Mission is a GBA game that looks so good I don't have to add the qualifier for a GBA game, which is high praise for a system often stymied by the lack of a backlit screen on the release model. There's only one drawback, and that's that the game suffers occasional performance drops. It's not nearly as bad or common as the original game, but the space pirate chases can chug sometimes. The soundtrack, similarly, is an absolute feast for the ears. Now, you guys all know me. The GBA was one of my first consoles, and I kind of have a soft spot for the sappy audio engine. Even today, I still prefer the GBA orchestrations of many soundtracks, even when the pieces have demonstrably higher fidelity on other platforms. Putting aside my GBA apologism, Zero Mission is one of the best sounding games to ever come out of the GBA speaker and could pass for an early release DS soundtrack. Series composers Kenji Yamamoto and Minako Hamano returned to arrange the original soundtrack for Game Boy Advance, giving the orchestration a very very Metroid Prime kind of feel. The samples are higher than average in quality for the GBA at 8-bit, 22.5 kHz, and sound phenomenal even on the original speaker. What's also neat is that unlike most GBA games, which are monaural, Zero Mission actually features stereo sound, though you'll need to use the analog out to take advantage of it on the release model. The orchestration in Zero Mission is far stronger than the original 8-bit renditions, with the more detailed timbre enhancing the emotion and immersion of the pieces. The Brinstar theme, for example, sounds triumphant and really puts a spring in your step in the early game. Prime-style choruses fit Norfair like a glove, and the addition of a bass line makes all the difference in the world for Ridley's Lair. There are some decent ambience-focused tracks as well. In Yamamoto and Hamino have always had a talent for making these sound like more than just background noise. The best track, of course, is Kraid's Lair, which takes everything that was great about the NES track and turns it up to 11. The whistling, the chorus, the bass line, the chord progression, it is better than the original and the best track in the series, Don't At Me. Jumping into gameplay, you'll quickly discover that Samus controls astronomically better than the original game. The controls are basically identical to Metroid Fusion, which had pretty much perfected the control scheme from Super Metroid while making a couple small things worse. You can duck and shoot, you can shoot downwards while jumping, and you can shoot diagonally up and down. The platforming is a bit quicker and snappier than it was in Fusion, and the ladders and monkey bars have been replaced with the ability to aim while hanging from a ledge. On that note, while ledge grabbing does return, you'll need to find the power grip before you can use it. In addition, Zero Mission improves over the last game by restoring some features from Super Metroid that were removed in Fusion. First, bombs now explode with more immediacy, which means that infinite bomb jumping is back on. Second, Zero Mission restores the ability to wall jump against a single wall, whereas Fusion locked your momentum for a bit after each wall jump. Between the tight physics, fast-paced movement, generous aiming ability, and the restored wall jump, Zero Mission has virtually perfected the 2D Metroid control scheme. Either way, jumping and shooting just feel inherently satisfying here in a way that they just didn't in the original. The next thing you'll discover is that the pace-breaking energy farming from the original is thankfully a thing of the past. Chozo statues now act as recharge stations, refilling your health and missiles, meaning that you'll never have to farm pickups to refill your health if you don't want to. Not only that, but there are also standing statues that will guide you to your next destination. While the NES game had almost no player guidance, Fusion would constantly halt the pace to tell you where to go. Personally, I think that worked in the context of that story, but still I can understand if some players found that overbearing. While the first few standing statues are required, later ones are easily skippable, so you can have as much or as little guidance as you want. Of course, the refined map system from Fusion returns as well, with undiscovered pickups represented as open circles and discovered pickups represented as dots. Needless to say, the navigation in Zero Mission is way better than the original. Save stations return from later games and are placed in convenient, easy-to-reach spots. Maybe they're a little too common for their own good, but I'll take this over the 24-character passwords from the NES version any day. In addition to the new power grip, a lot of other power-ups introduced in later games were retrofitted into Zero Mission as well. First off, you unlock the space jump towards the end of the game, and it retains its less picky button timings from Fusion. Super missiles return to their Super Metroid roots in this game with a dedicated ammo count. Expansions only increase your reserves by 2 in the normal difficulty, but super missiles do even more damage than before to compensate. The charge beam carries over from later games, acting as a backup for when you run out of missiles and allowing you to do the pseudo screw attack. The ice beam can now damage enemies while frozen, and there are actually some puzzles built around this mechanic. More importantly, you're not forced to make a one-sided choice between the ice beam and the wave beam. Like Super Infusion, all your beam properties stack together, allowing for the best of both worlds. Later on, you also unlock the plasma beam to kill basic enemies even faster. You also unlock power bombs, but much like Super Infusion, they feel pretty useless outside of parts where they're required. Put together, Samus just has a lot more tools for dealing with baddies than she did in the original, all the while bringing the game back up to standards of later games in the series. Having perfected the controls, the mechanics, and the navigation, Zero Mission continues rendering the original obsolete with the most important change of all, the level design. Now, of course, Zero Mission adds new areas in Crateria and Chozodia, but we'll get to those. In terms of the returning areas, however, the overall arrangement of hallways and shafts is surprisingly faithful to the original game, even if details within those rooms often differ significantly. You'll find suit upgrades in exactly the same places, there's still an energy tank hidden in the ceiling in this room, there's still a missile tank on top of a pillar in this room, and analogous rooms tend to share similar graphical flourishes. Despite the macro similarities, individual rooms have seen a massive design overhaul that puts Zero Mission on even footing with the rest of the series. The improvement to the level design is so staggering that it's hard to know where to even begin. For one thing, the original's tendency to recycle the same rooms over and over to pad out the game to saleable length is gone. Every room in Zero Mission looks and plays differently from the rest. Not only does that make this game a breeze to navigate from memory, but it's just more fun to play and leaves you in anticipation of what you'll uncover next. Next, the superior graphics do a much better job of signifying and projecting hidden secrets. Like I said in part 1, it feels fun to pick up on subtle clues like these and use them to discover the way forward or uncover hidden pickups to fortify your arsenal. Because the map system will tell you if you haven't found a pickup in that room, the game can even get away with the collectibles being a little obscure in some places. You'll recall that most of the pickups in the original were just lying out in the open, and unfortunately that's a characteristic that carries over to their Zero Mission equivalents. However, Zero Mission also features dozens of new pickups that are hidden behind puzzles or tricky platforming. Sometimes you need to freeze an enemy with the ice beam to use as a platform, and other times you need to bomb blocks and navigate morph ball passages. While progression in the 2D games almost always centers on improving Samus's abilities, Zero Mission dabbles in the more contextual progression from the 3D games as well, namely the Tango Fruit and Brinstar in the ceiling-mounted handles in Kraid's lair. These are used for progression, puzzle solving, and even for a boss, and I think they're a fine addition to the base gameplay. Given that Samus mechanically reached her peak in Super Metroid or arguably Fusion, I think branching out into ideas like these is a fine avenue to explore in future 2D games. After gaining a new appreciation for the freedom of routing in the original, one thing I was concerned about was that Zero Mission would overly linearize the level design. At first blush, this appears to be the case. You're not allowed to enter Norfair without the bombs, unlike the original, and a Tangle Fruit will spawn to prevent you from entering Lower Norfair until you collect the Power Grip. However, if you attempt to push against the Golden Path, you'll discover that a lot of the original's freedom of choice is still here. For one, only the following upgrades are required to finish the game: the Morph Ball, the first missile tank, the bombs, the ice beam, the 3 unknown items, and the Power Grip. Everything else you can pretty much collect in any order you want or skip altogether. The entirety of Lower Norfair is still totally optional, just like the original, and it's entirely possible to fight Ridley before Kraid if you want to. Entering Ridley's lair early requires discovering the secret passageway in Norfair, which itself requires wall jumping and infinite bomb jumping finesse. The early Varia suit requires mastery of the infinite bomb jump, something I only really learned how to do for this review. By contrast, if you're fast enough, it's possible to speed through the superheated areas of Lower Norfair without the Varia suit. A series of careful ball sparks will net you an early super missile, while a well-aimed Shinespark unlocks an early screw attack. And these are only the skips that I happen to know about. I'm sure that there are plenty more that I never even considered. While the freedom of routing in the original appears to be a consequence of loose, unpolished design and was based on route knowledge more than anything else, sequence breaking in Zero Mission was an intentional design choice that rewards players with alternate routing opportunities for mastering the more advanced mechanics. The result is that players looking for an easier, more linear experience can just follow the Chozo statues and have a good time, while returning or more experienced players can still mix up their routing to an extent comparable to the original game. Frankly, the added finesse just makes sequence breaking more rewarding than the original game and is just good, cheeky fun. The drawback to this freedom of choice is that the first 2/3 of the game suffer from a bit of the Mega Man syndrome. Since the player can hypothetically approach bosses and areas in any order, the difficulty can't really escalate the way it would in a more linear experience. The result is a game that's fairly easy if you just follow the Chozo statues and go for 100% completion, but can also be a lot more challenging if you choose to veer off the Golden Path. Speaking of of which, the bosses are generally just as easy as their NES counterparts, though they resemble their Super Metroid incarnations more in execution. Kraid especially is basically just the Super Metroid fight, except he's facing the opposite direction, and Ridley on the normal difficulty is arguably the easiest boss in the history of games. Zero Mission actually introduces a few new bosses, but none of them are all that great, which is weird because the same dev team made Fusion, and that game had good and mostly very original bosses. The Dioram is easy peasy, and the Mua isn't much harder, but at least he has the ceiling handles to spice things up. The Kirugiro slugs are basically regular enemies, and the one suspended from the ceiling isn't much different. The boss fight with the Imago basically amounts to walking back and forth and shooting the boss as it passes. If I could sum up all of these new bosses in one phrase, it would be one note. These bosses just don't evolve or expand, making them less of a proper boss fight and more like an enemy that takes longer to defeat. I know that Fusion had a reputation for being kind of hard to the point where the Japanese version actually added an easy mode, but I feel like the devs overcorrected here because this game is generally too easy even on the normal difficulty. After defeating Ridley and Kraid, you move on to the endgame like normal. The Metroid encounters here are probably the best in the 2D series so far, particularly the ones where you unwittingly bomb your way into an ambush. Mother Brain is a little different from the NES and SNES fights in that she'll fight you more directly rather than relying on the turrets and the Rinkas to protect her. Of course, this fight is only one phase, so we go immediately into the escape sequence, which runs a little longer this time and features collapsing platforms and the escape shaft. So yeah, that was Metroid Zero Mission, and yeah, just kidding, we're not quite done yet. So, Zero Mission definitely corrects for the lack of Zebezians in the original game, because now you have to infiltrate a mothership full of them, armed with nothing but your wits and an emergency pistol. Now, I don't know if this is a hot take, but I actually rather enjoy this section. Stealth in a Metroid game kind of sounds like a beef chocolate sandwich, but it works surprisingly well. Metroid as a series is generally about the thrill of gradually empowering yourself, so stripping away the player's abilities down to basics and forcing them to go against much more powerful enemies creates instant tension. In terms of how these stealth sections are designed, the encounters are exciting and there are still plenty of skips to try if you're impatient. Or you could throw caution to the wind and hurl yourself directly into danger, which is faster but will have dozens of Zebezians nipping at your heels. Either way, the stealth gameplay doesn't last so long that it starts to become annoying or tedious, and before you know it, Samus is facing off against yet another easy boss. Defeating it recovers your power suit and unlocks the 3 unknown items you couldn't use before. Why? Well, you know how in the original NES game the Varia suit is just a recolor and doesn't have the iconic shoulder pads that debuted in Metroid 2? Well, apparently defeating this Chozo Guardian guy unlocks the legendary power suit, which obviously has the iconic shoulder pads. And apparently that's what she needed to use the unknown items, all of which are abilities that debuted after the first game. I was not expecting this remake to explain where the shoulder pads came from, let alone that the pads are functional apparently, but that's so out of left field that I kinda like it. Unfortunately, the game kind of goes downhill from here in my opinion. While the initial trip through the Chozo ruins was fun, without the stealth gameplay to make it interesting, it just amounts to a giant serpentine hallway. There is some fun to blasting away space pirates with your fully upgraded suit after all the grief they put you through in the stealth section, but that novelty wears off pretty quickly when you realize that ultimately you're gonna have to replay everything you just played in reverse with no shortcuts. Up to this point, the backtracking in Zero Mission has registered on the lower end for the series. There's more of it than the largely compartmentalized Metroid 2, but not nearly as much as the Prime games. If you're going for 100%, that all changes in the back half of the game, where you'll spend a good 10 to 30 minutes revisiting old areas to clean up the remaining collectibles. See, you need the power bombs to flesh out the Chozo ruins. Where are those? At the top of the pirate mothership next to the final boss. So that means that if you're going for 100%, you're gonna have to backtrack all the way through the Chozo ruins and snake your way back up to the top of the mothership, grab the power bombs, then turn around and go all the way back to where the Chozo ghost was. I wouldn't mind this nearly as much if there were shortcuts to expedite the process, but there's no way around it. You're walking through all of these hallways at least 4 times if you're going for 100%, and it slows the endgame to a crawl. Of course, you can go back to Brinstar, Norfair, and the rest afterwards backwards, and you'll have to if you want to reach 100%. Truth be told, the backtracking here isn't actually that bad, since there are convenient shortcuts to get from Norfair to Kraid's Lair, which then snakes up through Crateria past Turian and loops back towards the Chozo ruins. So basically, they did everything they could to make the revisits as painless as possible, but the fact that there is so much endgame cleanup is kind of the problem. Unfortunately, pointlessly long cleanup sessions became a staple of the series in the 2000s, and Zero Mission is actually shorter and more straightforward in this regard than something like Fusion or the Prime games, but it's still not nearly as slick and clean as Super Metroid's endgame. What's also annoying is that, much like Fusion, the map screen doesn't even have so much as a percentage counter to help you keep track. Like that game, there are item counters to help you out, and Zero Mission improves over Fusion by allowing you to view maps of other sub-areas without having to physically travel there. However, you still have to unlock the counters by either beating the final boss or playing the game in New Game Plus. And as far as I can tell, there's nothing in the game that tells you New Game Plus even exists. I'll bet many of you didn't even know there was a New Game Plus. The option is squirreled away within a submenu and is labeled as New, and all it tells you is that the screw attack symbol won't be deleted. So as long as you pick New Game Plus every time after you first beat the game, you're all good to go. But I really don't understand why the counters have to be unlocked in the first place. It just overcomplicates what by all rights should be a straightforward user experience. I don't mind the backtracking nearly as much as Zero Mission's single greatest flaw. Super Metroid introduced the speed booster and a superpowered jump called the Shinespark by getting a running start, crouching, and jumping. Fusion expanded this mechanic by refining the controls, allowing you to use slopes to chain multiple Shinesparks in a row. Neither Fusion or Zero Mission do a very good job explaining how the Shinespark controls work, so at some point I just figured out that to do a Shinespark in midair, you have to hold up on the control pad and press A in a weird way that's hard to explain. With these innovations, Fusion introduced these irritating puzzles emphasizing the Shinespark, which we'll talk about more in that review. There were a few power-ups in Super Metroid that required the Shinespark as well, but with the exception of this Meridia one, none of them were really that bad. Now, apparently someone on the dev team really liked Shinespark puzzles because now there are roughly a dozen of them in this game. I don't mind the ones that are just shortcuts because that's rewarding experienced players with a faster clear time. Some of the actual puzzles are even okay. Many of them, however, seem to have been deliberately designed to be as obnoxious as possible. Like this one, where you have to follow this collapsing platform and make perfect wall jumps. Or this one, where you have to repeatedly charge into ramps and dock without losing your charge in the meanwhile. Or this one, where you have to charge your Shinespark by this pillar, space jump repeatedly through the air without Shinesparking prematurely, and then take a wild guess where you're supposed to Shinespark to the right so you'll be at the precise altitude. Or this one, where you have to speed boost through 3 rooms and then take a wild guess where you're supposed to diagonally Shinespark from to reach this power bomb here. Now, I could complain about every single puzzle, but the bottom line is that they amount to trial and error bullshit and makes 100%ing this game a pain in the butt for newer players. These puzzles are things that you can get good at with a lot of patience and practice, but the first time user experience comes off as though the designer is deliberately trolling you. These puzzles are a shocking addition for a game that's otherwise very well optimized for speedrunning. Everything else, from the snappy controls to the short cutscenes to the simple bosses to the shortcuts to the overall low difficulty, feel like they were optimized for the nascent speedrunning community that developed directly in response to games like Doom and Super Metroid. There's even a secret time attack mode you can unlock by selecting Start a New Game and pressing up, left, right, and down. Beating the game under this mode will record your best times in a new screen of the options menu, both any percent and 100%. As you can see, I am very much out of practice. It's just a shame that my preferred way of running these games involves so many frustrating, pace-breaking Shinespark puzzles. The final boss against Mecha Ridley is probably the best boss in the game with the most varied attack cycle, but even then he's generally pretty easy. However, if you fight the boss at 100% completion, his health is tripled and his damage is doubled. Afterwards, you go into the final escape sequence, which ends with Samus escaping Zebes on a pirate fighter and annihilating the space pirate mothership. Finishing the game on normal mode unlocks hard mode, and while most of the differences are mathematical, hard mode is generally more challenging than the other two modes. Enemies do twice as much damage, with more of them appearing in tougher versions to boot. Energy tanks are now worth only 50 units, meaning your maximum health is 699 units, just like in the NES game. Missile tanks are only worth 2 units, while super missile and power bomb tanks are only worth 1. This is annoying for 100% since enemies never seem to drop power bombs and you'd need tons of them to clear out the endgame. Even the bosses are slightly more interesting, though the Dioram, the Mua, and the Imago still aren't anything special. Ridley goes from one of the easiest bosses in the game to one of the hardest. Touch damage can kill you in 6 hits, so getting right on top of him and pelting him with super missiles isn't a viable strategy anymore. The number of Metroids and Turian have multiplied, making for a tense romp where I thought I was a goner multiple times. Both of the escape sequences have a much shorter fuse, making for a slimmer margin of victory. Zebesians can kill you in the stealth section in only a couple of hits, and there are fewer save stations to access along the way to keep your health up. Couple Mecha Ridley's 100% buff with hard mode stats, and he makes for a challenging final boss on hard mode. His touch damage is surprisingly the most powerful attack and can kill you in 2 hits. It took me several tries to finish him off, only to die to these elite pirates in the escape sequence. After several more tries, I managed to beat Mecha Ridley again, and with some clever maneuvering managed to outwit the pirates. So, while normal mode is definitely too easy, hard mode does provide a decent challenge to those looking for it. Finishing the game on hard mode unlocks a sound test, which is self-explanatory. If for some reason hard mode still isn't hard enough for you, then a Minimalist Run should prove an ultimate test of your Metroid skills. Much like the original game, a Minimalist experience focuses more on evasion than defense, because with only 99 energy, you really can't afford to get hit. And if you actually liked the farming in the original game, then good news, everyone! Every boss encounter will see you farming for pickups, especially those stupid Zebetites. Get ready to see that game over screen more times than you could ever imagine. For the truly bold, combine a Minimalist Run with hard mode. Now, I know this isn't really a substitute for a decent default difficulty, since the player has to actively go out of their way to avoid every item that might help. And if I'm being honest, playing the game this way is just frustrating. Most of the game is fine, but Ridley, Mother Brain, and Mecha Ridley are just grind fests where you spend most of your time waiting around to get your missiles back. And it seems like they can just one-shot you out of nowhere whenever they feel like it. It doesn't help that for the 2 Ridleys, the save rooms are roughly a minute of mundane gameplay away from the boss, and redoing that every time you respawn gets really tedious really quickly. After 6 hours of throwing my head against the brick wall that is Mecha Ridley, I only managed to beat him about 10 times. The real problem is the escape sequence. The pirates can kill you in half a second with no warning, and thanks to Mecha Ridley, it might take you upwards of a half hour to be able to try it again. And if you thought those elite pirates were hard before, then my heart nearly stopped fighting them here. With an effort that can only be described as Herculean, I managed to beat the game on 9%. And let me tell ya, there are few moments in my life where I've ever felt as triumphant as I did then. Yes! I am the greatest! The silver lining is that you get an exclusive gallery picture for finishing the game with less than 15%, and if that's all you care about, definitely flesh out the remaining 6% with some essential pickups to make it even marginally easier for yourself. 9% is purely for bragging rights and doesn't even have its own time attack category. The bottom line is that while Zero Mission's any % normal difficulty experience is in fact too easy, the low difficulty lends itself well to speedrunning and new players, while there are ways to make the experience more challenging if you're so inclined. Meanwhile, a certain other remake in the franchise only really pursues one of those audiences effectively to the detriment of all the others. Finishing the game on any difficulty unlocks an emulated version of the original Metroid. In addition to reimagining Metroid to the standards of the 2000s, Zero Mission also paradoxically makes the original game better as well, even if it is technically an emulation. This emulation features a quasi easy save feature. Whenever you die, Zero Mission will prompt you to save your most recent password, which is the best of both worlds. If you want to use the Justin Bailey password and unlock Armorless Samus, then you can do that. If you don't want to remember passwords, then you can have the game remember them for you. Otherwise, this emulation is pretty close to the original NES game, right down to the color glitch and the performance issues. I don't really mind that because that's kind of the point of the emulation, to provide new players with the unvarnished original experience to compare the remake to. The only meaningful difference is that obviously the NES runs at a higher resolution than the Game Boy Advance. Consequently, some of the graphics look a bit squat, but for an emulation, that's acceptable, and at least there isn't any screen crunch. Taking the place of a standard reset button, you can also access a special menu by holding L and R, from which you can return to the remake. Now, some of you might be wondering, isn't the Zero Mission emulation identical to the NES Classics version that released 6 months later? Well, they are pretty close, but there are some minute differences. The NES Classics version has the same save feature as well as a special menu accessible with L and R. As you might expect, nothing about the level design has really changed or improved. By the same token, the usual performance issues and color glitch are still here. Getting into differences, there's no option to quit to the main menu since there's no remake this time around. The color palette is very slightly different in some places. More importantly, however, the conversion of the graphics for the smaller screen is much better in the NES Classics version. The Zero Mission solution seems to be to chop off 2 rows of pixels in each 16x16 tile, which works, but makes the bubbles in Norfair look kinda funky. The NES Classics version, meanwhile, seems to use point sample scaling to resize each tile, which gives a more uniform look that's more reminiscent of the original game. The only exception is the title screen, which seems to have what can only be described as interlace flicker. Some of the in-game destructible blocks have a tendency to flicker or distort as well. If anything, it just makes the bombable areas a mite less cryptic, so I'm not complaining. So, if you absolutely must own the original NES Metroid on GBA and want only the best, then the NES Classics version is probably the way to go. It's also cheaper than an authentic Zero Mission cart, but yeah, we'll get to that. So, remake or rebreak? How well does Metroid Zero Mission recreate and improve upon the original Metroid? Put simply, Metroid Zero Mission is one of the best remakes I'll ever review on this segment, right up there with Ocarina of Time 3D. All the problems with the original game, from the lack of recharge stations to the navigation to the password system, have been fixed and improved the overall user experience 1,000 times over. Despite that, Zero Mission manages to successfully walk a fine line between remaking the original and reimagining it, creating an experience that's familiar yet fresh. Despite being shackled to an older game, Zero Mission still manages to top Super Infusion in its visual, sound, controls, and overall pacing. Much like Ocarina of Time 3D, I struggle to think of a single thing the original game does better. Maybe the music if you're a chiptune aficionado, but even then the new soundtrack definitely outpaces most other games in the GBA in terms of sound quality. Even if you do think the original game is better, Zero Mission includes a fully playable emulation of the original with a save feature, so in that case, I say just buy the remake. Because of that, I can confidently award Zero Mission the highest honor on Remake or Rebreak: replays. I reserve this score for only the best of the best, those re-releases that improve and add so much that they render the original version virtually obsolete. Zero Mission is the standard bearer for the replays tier, taking one of the weakest games in its respective franchise and transforming it into one of its best. If you haven't played it already, then I highly recommend buying a copy and checking it out for yourself, especially if you're new to the series and are looking for a place to start. It is the earliest game in the timeline after all. I should warn you that if you go for a physical copy, that there are a lot of repros floating around. When I started pre-production for this review, I learned that the one I've had for the past 10 years was a fake with a PAL ROM installed on it, so I had to order an authentic North American one for this review. If authenticity is important to you, then loose North American carts can go anywhere from $50 to $90 US, which is pretty expensive even for a game this good. That's why I'd recommend checking it out on the Wii U Virtual Console if you can. Otherwise, well, wouldn't it be nice if Nintendo added GBA games to their Switch Online? All I'm saying is that Nintendo isn't exactly making it easy to play their older games on newer hardware right now. With all that said, is Zero Mission my favorite game in the series? While this game is legitimately a blast to play, and has the best controls and overall flow in the series, I'm not as confident that it's my favorite in the series as I used to be. It really sank in for me during this review that the bosses are horribly balanced for an any percent playthrough, and the lack of shortcuts makes Chozodia a pain in the butt to 100%. Also, no matter how efficient I get at the Shinespark puzzles, I still think they serve to annoy more than anything else. On the other hand, reviewing this game gave me a much deeper appreciation for how the game rewards the mastery of wall jumps and infinite bomb jumps with the freedom to route the first 2/3 of the game pretty much however you want. With most other Metroid games, that's only really possible by attempting to glitch past the intended design. But with Zero Mission, the presence of sequence breaks is 100% deliberate, which makes for a smoother experience in attempting to go outside of the box. In the end, you could say I fell in love with this game all over again, but also remembered why I stopped trying to run it. I love Zero Mission, but there are still 2 games that could potentially dethrone it. The good news is that you guys won't have to wait that long to find out, because we'll be reviewing one of them next. Speaking of which, it's high time we revisited Metroid 2 to talk about the Game Boy original, the excellent fan remake AM2R, which has received a host of updates since I last reviewed it, and a game I've never even covered before, the 2017 3DS remake Samus Returns. If you liked today's review, make sure to give it a like and consider subscribing for more. You can also find me on the Unversed Cast, where I meet up with Haydox, Ryroll, and King K to talk about video games and read bad fanfiction.
Ryan, I just cut off my fourth. Here it is.
You can find video versions of the podcast on YouTube and an audio version on SoundCloud and iTunes. I also have a Let's Play channel, EPG Plays, where I do informative playthroughs of games I like and some I don't. It's also the new home of Zebros Play, sillier playthroughs I do with my brother.
Have you ever seen the Gummy Bear Christmas movie?
No, that sounds like something you and undisclosed sibling have watched together many times. Fuck! Be sure to go check those out. Until next time, I'm ExoParadigmGamer, and I hope you all enjoyed the review.